Tonight is a very special night for many reasons, one of which we're going to be awarding Dr. Salamishah Tillet with the inaugural Monument Lab Changemaker Award. We have some friends here in real life with us. And this is meant to recognize your advocacy, your excellence, your vision in the fields of public memory, art, and activism. As a critic, as a scholar, as an activist, and also just such a dear friend and person who's lifted up Monument Lab's work from the very beginning. That was not just Monument Lab as an organization, that was Monument Lab before it was an organization, as a dear friend and as a mentor, and has been there through each of this. So we are really excited to be honoring you tonight as part of this fall gathering. And we're memory buffs.
Yeah.
So before we get started in our conversation about art, activism, and democracy, we wanted to take a look back. Okay, so let's start in the beginning. Well, the beginning on a few fronts. So this is the first public exhibition that Monument Lab put on, curated by myself, Ken Lum, our team, and with the artwork by the late Terry Adkins. And here were you with friend and dear one, Dr. John Jackson, speaking in the courtyard of Philadelphia City Hall. This was in 2015. And of course, Seneca, who will be coming soon.
Yeah. Well, that's Sydney.
Oh, that's Sydney.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
So just thinking about your family, we'll talk more about family in a moment, but just appreciating all of the cycles. So that's a start. Let me go to the next slide. Back in the courtyard, but it felt like a lot of life between the first and the second time. This is you leading conversation with Hank Willis Thomas and Tariq Trotter, Black Thought of the Roots. In a really meaningful day. This is the fall of 2017. You led a conversation about Hank Willis Thomas's All Power to All People, which you wrote about in the Monument Lab book, and just grounded us in a conversation that spilled out to the city and beyond. And that being there, you were also at the closing event to close out. So just, again, thinking of these milestones here in Philly. But anytime the Monument Lab has also been in other places, you've been there as well. So we go to the next slide, Chicago. So giving a shout out to our collaboration with A Long Walk Home, Dear Long Walk Home, which you are the co-founder of. I'm on the board of, that you co-founded with your sister, Scheherazade Tillet. And here was the Black Girl Takeover in Douglas Park that we worked on together. And of course, wanted to appreciate the presence of Cher, but also of Seneca and Sydney, your kids who are deeply part of that moment, and all of the Long Walk Home girlfriends. And then moving forward, our time together in Newark, where we co-curated a call to peace. And while we were able to engage with Mayor Ras Baraka, with other city leaders, actually just being able to climb a monument with you defiantly was really inspiring. And I think just personally, to be able to curate a project with your dear mentor and friend is a humbling experience, it's an energizing one. You got to really stay on your game with it. I'm just thinking about how every step of Monument Lab's work, you have not just been there with us, but you've been out front. And we've been trying to follow in your footsteps. So there's no other person that we would want to honor other than you in this moment. Okay. So let's give a round of applause for Salamishah. For those in here, if you were at home, raise your hand. So that was just a bit of a start to our day today.
Well, thank you. I mean, I started smiling when you were speaking before you went to the slideshow, just because I was thinking of how far back I go with you, but of course, when Monument Lab was just first conceived as a proposal, and then becomes a project, and now is a full-blown organization. So it's been really beautiful to witness and to be part of it. So it's just, that was just really, and then to see to track it according to my children's growth is pretty also impressive too, because now you know how big your organization is. So it's quite beautiful to see. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So those are meant to set off the beginning of our conversation: art, activism, and democracy. And again, this is a pre-program for our fall gathering here in Philly, and we get a chance to talk together. We have friends who are joining us virtually. We have a handful of people safely distanced from us in the room to keep us company here. And just to give a note, we're going to be talking, there won't be a Q&A, but for those who want to continue the conversation, you can do so online at monument_lab, at Salamishah, and continue that conversation. So the way we're going to do, I'm going to kick off, and then we'll go back and forth.
Yeah.
And I want to just to start off, sometimes we talk a lot about journeys, about the past, present, and future. And there's a way I kind of want to ask you about your artistic and intellectual biography, but I want to ask you that through the framework of reflecting on and thinking about people who have influenced you or impacted you along your journey as a critic, as a scholar, as a memory worker. Who are some of those people that impacted you along the way?
Yeah, I mean, I would say my parents being the most important. I grew up in a household. My mother's a musician, a singer, and my father, while he was a finance person, he was an accountant. He gave my sister her first camera, right? So we grew up in a household in which art and music were really not just validated, but were actually considered kind of part of, it's someone else, it's the air you breathe, right? And so to grow up in a household as working class Black people, to grow up in a household in which art was what we breathe, I think gave me permission very early on to think about music and film and television. I'm really interdisciplinary, and theater as something that I should kind of engage constantly and pursue. So that's like my formative years. And I always tell this story that growing up in Boston, I was born in Boston. I would take classes at the Museum of Fine Arts as a kid, right? Free classes at the Museum of Fine Arts there. But then also around the corner from where we lived in Dorchester was the Elmer Lewis Cultural Center. And so it was there that, my sister and I participated in our first musical, which was Black Nativity. And it was there that we also learned the importance of art as a space of gathering, and Black art in particular, as a way of making community and making one's way in the world. And so it makes sense to me in many ways that I've ended up here. But then I would say in high school, I had two really important English teachers, Mr. Orsini, Alfonso Orsini, and Miss O'Donnell, who both taught me to push beyond what's the written word, what I saw on the page, and to really become a critic. And that's something I always liked reading, but to actually become a critic, to try to take what was seen on the page and try to understand what was the layers that it had, or the meanings that were part of it. I learned hard in a way, because I think I got a C on my first English paper in my freshman year. It was in a Robert Frost poem. But Mr. Orsini never really let us think that such standards, we had to rise to the occasion. So I learned how to be a critic in high school. And then when I went to college, I had really wonderful professors at Penn, our mutual place. And I would say Farber Jasmine Griffin is a lodestar. To have a Black feminist professor who was both attuned to my emotional well-being and my intellectual growth, modeled what mentoring looks like and what friendship eventually would look like when the person's your mentor and then they become your friend. And then I'll just speed up quickly. I've got lots of people to thank. But then I would say, in grad school, I went to Harvard, and I had Henry Louis Gates and Werner Sollers and Evelyn Higginbotham as models. And I understood more and more what it meant to be like a public figure and a public intellectual. Michael Eric Dyson, who we shared at Penn. And then I would just say I've had new mentors along the way, Gloria Steinem. But I think my biggest imprint is my sister, Scheherazade Tillet, who is a beautiful activist and cultural theorist and artist. And so there's very few things I've done without asking Scheherazade for her advice or her insight. And this notion that sisterhood can be a kind of basis of democracy and is a model of feminism, I learned from growing up with her. So
I know we're supposed to go back and forth, but I can't help but ask a
okay.
follow-up to that.
Okay.
You said sisterhood as a basis for democracy.
Mm.
So Scheherazade is a renowned photographer and organizer in her own right. And I think there are, I know from talking to you and knowing and seeing how you have, been a part of public events and, major programs, and Scheherazade has been as well. You've co-written pieces together, but I also know there's like a lot of process behind that. Like you will, if you're working on a piece, I've heard, moments where like you're really thinking it with her. And I'm just curious, because a lot of people will see what comes out front, but what is the process like? And not just challenges or bright spots, but what is it like to be in such a deep bond and one that is purposeful in that collaboration with your sister?
Yeah, I mean, part of it's like, which is how we grew up, so there's a way in which the collaborations we were doing as children, right? We would stage these performances every year, and not just at the holidays, but my sister and I started in Boston and moved to Trinidad and then moved back to New Jersey. And so we had this game that was a very elaborate game that involved the Jackson Five that travels with us throughout the diaspora. And it was so deep, but we were like in the world of that game for so long. And, again, we would stage these performances. So I think we learned early on how to like vibe off of each other. And so we have a kind of shorthand that's both artistic, but then also political. And I think when my sister asked if she could photograph my healing process, I'm a sexual assault survivor, and I shared my story with her in 1997. Her response in time was to as I was actively healing, she asked if she could photograph that process. And this is in 1998. So I had no idea, we live in a different moment now with social media and with documentation. I had no idea that would become a performance itself and then become the basis of our organization, A Long Walk Home. But I think because we had that trust, that intimacy, and that shared aesthetic and political value system, not only did it make the process of creating story of a rape survivor more meaningful, but I always say this to her, and she always gets so moved, that she saved my life in a particular way, that I was healing. But I think that Scheherazade, in the spirit of the kind of the best artists that we know who are deeply radical, was able to enable me to see my journey as something quite sublime and beautiful. And I don't think that couldn't have happened without her. I could have had my own process, but to have it as collaborative, as sisterhood, and then also help so many other people heal, that's a gift that my sister gave me and that I hope we've given other people too. So
thank you.
Yeah. I don't know if you knew that was going to be the question. So I have a question for you, because our journeys have obviously intersected, and I've been part of your journey as you've been part of my journey. And one of mine is a question about place. We're here in Philadelphia, but I think I've never asked you, why is it when you went to Berlin that that's one of the experiences that changed the trajectory of your intellectual development, but also your monuments, your relationship to monuments. What was it about, that moment you got there when you realized the way in which they engaged history, or the way in which they engaged a really deeply problematic past? How did that inspire you? What was it about coming from Philly, going to Berlin, that relationship between these two cities that you embodied and embraced? Why did that activate this?
Yeah. I think there are things that I see in common between Philadelphia and Berlin, but a lot of other cities that I care about. And I always think about cities as places where we innovate toward the future, we pilot new things, and where we come to terms with the past, where the bodies are buried, where ancestors leave their markings, and that creates a pull in two directions, and kind of where you find yourself is inevitably in between these layers, if not crunches of time. And growing up in a Jewish household, we did not ever dream of going to Germany.
Mhm.
You know, and I would hear about family or friends who also shared Eastern European Jewish ancestry, and they would talk about reclaiming their roots, and they would tell these stories of like zigzagging across Europe and avoiding Germany.
Mhm.
And I don't know, sometimes when you're told something you shouldn't do, you get intrigued by it. But I took a class as an undergrad at Penn by Professor Christina McLeod on the city of Berlin. And we read German Jewish writers like Walter Benjamin and Theodor Adorno. And I thought, German Jewish writers? Like, and they were inspiring me to think about history in the current moment that I was living in. So as a college student, I went to Berlin. I was studying abroad in London at Goldsmiths. And I went to Berlin for the weekend.
I don't know any of this. I didn't know
Okay,
you went
well, this is
there.
good.
Yeah.
This is the pre. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I was playing in a soccer tournament, actually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And I went and I was blown away. I felt more comfortable being Jewish and queer in Berlin than I did anywhere else on that semester in Europe. And I felt, you know, I didn't speak German, but I spoke with a lot of people who spoke English, which I later would find out is a legacy of the Cold War and the Americanization of parts of Berlin. And I remember on that trip, I was taken by our hosts to the Neue Synagogue, the new synagogue, which was not a new synagogue. It was heavily damaged and desecrated, you know, on the eve of and through World War II. And then it laid in ruins during the Cold War because it was on the edge of East Berlin and East Germany. And it was rebuilt after the dismantling of the wall. And the whole building was refurbished. It was beautiful gold dome that you could see from blocks away. But you walk in, and where you would find yourself entering the chapel, the place of prayer, was left blank, was left empty. It was a glass separating you from what appeared like a gravel lot. And it was so revelatory for me. I was thinking, like, I'm looking to find a place to rest, a place to find peace. And it was like the scar of this place was not being hidden. And from that trip forward, it just made me have a different relationship to history. I left there not only feeling the weight of history, but feeling a release. And it unlocked a few things for me when I came back to America. I immediately started thinking about, well, what was I not finding in the United States? And at around the same time, when I came back, I was learning a lot about the history of police brutality and uprisings against systemic violence from a century ago. And I realized I had never encountered that as a site of memory in the city. And it had me thinking that. It had me thinking about, you know, as a Jewish and queer person, where could I go in Berlin that was not traumatized? And then I thought, well, if you're in the United States as a Black or Indigenous person or anyone who carries history, where can you go that is not a place of trauma, but also a place of survival and sustenance and finding a way through? And that stuck with me. When I went to graduate school, I got there. I went to Michigan, where you very thoughtfully helped guide me to pick that as an option. You were there as a postdoc. And I was there for a week, and I thought, I have a lot of love for Ann Arbor, but I got to go somewhere else. And I got a grant, and I left. I thought I would leave America. I would go find myself. And then I realized all the other people doing the same thing at the coffee shops and historic sites. I was like, oh, you all are here doing the same thing. I realized that there was some kind of choreography that I was a part of. And while I was there and I thought I left America, I realized the imprint of American empire and geopolitics was there. I would encounter streets named after US generals and Dr. King. And all of the many ideas I had about American history, I was finding resonating in Berlin, a place where I felt very at home and haunted at the same time. And I do think it's about those scars of the city. There was not an attempt to push away, to cover up, but to come to terms. And the monuments and memorials, some are big as a city block, some are small as a cobblestone. They also exist with financial repair and educational systems. And I just felt like the work, as Germans have a term, working off the past.
Mhm.
I felt that as someone coming as a visitor.
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, I think we share that in common, even though I didn't have the Berlin experience. My first book called Sites of Slavery is about, how do we remember antebellum slavery within American civic culture? The book itself explores the period from like the 1969 to really early 2000s. And I looked at how artists and activists and intellectuals engaged in the kind of pilgrimages, either they're intellectual or artistic or sometimes physical journeys, to recover a memory of slavery in the United States because of the way in which amnesia was the dominant way in which slavery was engaged. And I remember having to read, I was at Penn in the 90s, and my senior year, I did a independent study with Farber Griffin, looking at the 18th and 19th century slave narratives. And while I was in college, there'd be a new novel, a new neo-slave narrative is what we call a new novel on slavery that would come out every year. And then I too was dealing with eventually my own trauma as a sexual assault survivor and therapy. And so I was really interested in the ways in which these novels about slavery were having, characters having flashbacks, or the way in which the trauma of the past kept on interrupting the present in these texts. And so then I ended up, studying this for my dissertation, and then ended up writing a book on the topic. But what was interesting was that because there were so few people who had engaged this idea of the memory of slavery at the time, I had to look at a lot of Holocaust narratives, and also the ways in which scholars had been thinking about how do we remember the Holocaust, right? Whether it's in Germany or whether it's in American literature. And so that became a kind of conversation I was having, but also a dialogue. And so I had to read about the way in which this huge trauma was taken up in Berlin in terms of monuments. So that's a thing that we have in common. So I have this chapter on, as Paul knows, I went to Ghana and I went to Benin and I went to the slave forts there. So in a way, an African American up until recently had to leave the United States in order to see monuments that were sites of trauma that were acknowledged as such, in order then to understand our positionality here in the United States. And that's a kind of weird and crazy, and it's a journey that I think a lot of Jewish Americans have gotten. You go to Auschwitz, and then it's a journey that many of people have. But what's interesting is that I have to leave the United States in order to understand the United States. And that's America's fraught relationship with the history of slavery and our ongoing relationship with white supremacy. So, but yeah, we share that in common.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, and I think that's a lot of where I found resonance in Berlin, because all of the stories about American history and American culture I was looking for, everyone had a Berlin story. Angela Davis, Audre Lorde, Leonard Fried, Shinkichi Tajiri, Michael Jackson, Keith Haring, Nina Simone was another person. And I guess as you talk about this shift, I think we talk a lot about this, that Toni Morrison's notion of, in saying this several decades ago, there is no place you and I can go or not go to summon the presence or absence of enslaved people. There's no skies, there's no memorial, no skyscraper lobby, no bench by the road. So the book had to do it. For you, as you are thinking about the roots of your work and now, what shifts do you see? Are there more sites of memory that you see yourself in? Or how do you adjust to the kind of sense of the memory landscape changing?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the topic of slavery, I mean, there's clearly more, right? So there's the Whitney plantation. Part of my obsession with the topic was traveling to Charleston and, different places where you have to doing plantation tours. And so it's interesting to finally have a plantation that's dedicated to the perspective of enslaved people. It's like the only one that's really centered on that. So there's more conversation. The African American, museum in DC, and the way in which it starts in the structure. You're starting with the Middle Passage. So I think there's more. I mean, we're in a different moment, and yet there's not enough, right? And so there was a debate that I remember Toni Morrison and Charles Johnson, it wasn't a real debate, but Charles Johnson critiques her mercy. Like, why do we need another novel on slavery in 2008? Because this is the year Obama gets inaugurated and becomes president. So there's this idea that maybe we don't need to talk about slavery anymore, which obviously is wrong. And obviously we can talk about why that was so wrong. But and she said something of the fact, like, it's an inexhaustible story. It's like talking, like, you can't have enough stories about the Holocaust. You can't have enough stories about the potato famine. You just can't have enough stories about slavery. And so we are still clearly in that moment that it's an untold story. And yet I think we have new narratives. Just this year, I think we were able to see, if you watched Underground Railroad, the adapted version by Barry Jenkins, it was a gorgeous, difficult miniseries to watch, but it was something that was it's hard to imagine even 10 years ago that we would have seen such a deep meditation on slavery. So the world has changed, and yet still not enough.
Thinking about how the literary imagination, public imagination, or public space imagination fit together, I'm thinking about Newark and your home, and you've been gracious enough to invite me to be a collaborator there, and there's a lot of really wonderful folks who we've worked with. And I'm thinking about whether it was the Call to Peace exhibition or more recent process, both you and I sat on a jury that the city convened, the city's Fahmy Shakur, for a new monument for Harriet Tubman. I'm happy to answer this too, but I want to hear from you. What did you learn by, as a leading voice on public memory, sitting on a municipal jury and being a part of that process?
Yeah, I mean, I think the story that's interesting to me is how we got there. So in June of 2020, when monuments all over the country were being taken down, I got a text, in the middle of the night, it felt that way anyway, that we were going to remove the Columbus statue, which is in Washington Park in downtown Newark. And so Scheherazade, who's always with me, was there, and we went and she photographed the moment and filmed it. And it was a small group of us, and it was in a way very Newark, though it could have happened in Philly, it could have happened in Detroit, where you have we're burning sage, and there's a poet speaking, and he's saying, tear it down, this is the end of white supremacy, 400 years. And so that was one thing, being there and watching a monument being taken down. I had no idea, even after all of our work together, and knowing, writing about slavery, I had no idea that that act would be such a release, meaning that the power that those monuments hold over us and our inability to both see ourselves in them and in the violence that they represent as a kind of day-to-day practice, like the power and the dehumanization that we experience on the most quotidian level of walking through a park, right? To have that taken down and to have it be the first construction crew that the city had hired, once they found out it was Columbus, they refused to do it. And so we ended up having a construction crew that was mostly Latinx men. And so you have Black, brown, some white people championing this moment was such a revelation and such a release. And then my sister was there, and there was a 9-year-old, she's 8-year-old girl, it was her birthday, Fatina. And her mom brought her and her older sister to the taking down of Columbus. And my sister asked her to stand in front of the base of the statue, and she says, will you be my monument? And in that moment, I don't know if Scheherazade was just being Scheherazade, like, paying homage to Black girls everywhere she is. But it was such a beautiful, I don't know, it was such a beautiful offering. And so when we had the opportunity to create a mural downtown Newark, I thought, well, this is a great image, like this little girl in front of this monument. And so with our colleagues, Rebecca John Paul and Chantal Fishberg, we designed a piece that's Will You Be My Monument? It's a 4-story mural on a building in Newark that's part of a series of buildings that are murals. It's mirrors, and it says, will you be my monument? And then there's this picture of Fatina. And then we did this ode to Black girlhood this spring, and we activated it, and we did this whole celebration of Black girls. And so to me, that's part of the story. Then by the time we get to the jury and we end up picking Nina Cook John to create a monument to Harriet Tubman in this park that we took down in Columbus, that to me, that story is just one of the most dynamic stories. And just, if I were part of it, if I just heard it, I was like, wow, what can you do when you take down something? What's born in response? What opportunities are created when you actually confront power, and you open up the space and invite other people in? And so that to me is the journey. So when we got to the part of, choosing people, I mean, that's icing on the cake. And then when Nina erects the Tubman statue, it's a glorious journey. So but the point, I guess your question was, what happens when you're in a city and the mayor's an activist, an artist, he's a child of artists and activists, and you have a city that's committed to equity and truth and justice. These are the things that can happen. And I think we were all in the spirit of that. And A Call to Peace, I think, really created a conversation about monuments in the city that people weren't having before. So I give great credit to Monument Lab, and to Rutgers Newark for helping that conversation grow.
I'm remembering when we were starting the project, we went to visit Mayor Barack
in the mobile unit.
In a mobile unit
on Clinton Avenue.
But I remember you, yeah, we won't forget that. But I remember you were like, we have a mayor who is an artist.
Yeah.
And what that did and how that opened up possibility, and an artist activist at that.
Yeah.
And I think
so the argument's easier to make.
Yeah. I mean, you still have to step your game up. And in fact, I remember that conversation and part of what came out is why monuments and why the monuments, how to go about engagement with them. But something else that struck me being on the jury with you and been on other juries is that we're at a moment where there are so many emergent ways to mark memory that are more dynamic, more grounded, more thoughtful, more inviting than a frozen statue looking off into the distance on high. And still, there are a lot of folks who've long been denied the esteem of the pedestal, of bronze, of marble, and that there are questions. There's not one way to do it. And I think of not just that jury, but other conversations I've been in, kind of balancing that. And I think part of it is for me is trying to remind people it's not as, like, on one hand, it's not a zero-sum game. There is not just one way, and there should not just be one way. At the same time, to really hear and listen to folks who are craving for representation in a number of different ways, even as we try to push against the myth of permanence, that illusion. And just that again struck me in that process.
Yeah, no, I mean, that was a big, but it's interesting. We came to consensus in the end quite easily. So I think this desire or this tension that we sometimes think between ephemera and permanence, and trying to live on that spectrum in terms of memory is really interesting. I think it's the challenge that we're all confronting. And it's also this idea of what is, on that kind of meta level, what is memory? What's memory's role in terms of creating a citizenry? What's memory's role in democracy? And is that always the same as the past, right? Or is that the same as history, or is that something else? And so these are the questions I think the monuments themselves have to take up and have to answer to a certain degree for us. So. Yeah. Oh, so okay. I did have more questions for you. Well, one of the things I was thinking about as we're talking about, writing and memoir and curation, and so you were working on your academic monograph, which is about, again, the journey or the ways in which Berlin becomes a particular site of intellectual and political growth for American artists and activists. As you're curating both the second phase, I guess, of Monument Lab that we saw in 2017. And then you also had the Monument Lab book, which was like a highly curated collaborative process. So I guess I wanted to ask you this question of knowledge production, but really a question of the writer curator, and how do you see them as connected, or how do you see them as, what parts of yourself are being pulled in one direction or the other? How do you take care of both? But really, how do you see them as distinct parts of yourself, or are they always living and breathing next to each other? So
yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's actually an eternal, I say this lovingly, an eternal struggle.
Yeah. Lovingly to yourself.
Yeah, I'm saying 11 to myself. Yeah. I think intentionality is very important. And so is reciprocity. When I say that, intentionality is trying to figure out your way in the world, trying to follow the pathways that other people have set for you, trying to figure out which ones to follow in the footsteps of and which ones to chart yourself, to find the right words. I myself and the members of the Monument Lab team, I put you in this if you want to claim it, that we say we're word nerds. And I say that, but it's really like the stakes matter. Like we don't want to use words that reify violent structures or prop up a status quo, but we want to use words that reach people, that invite them in. So how do you invite people in, many kinds of people, but speak with a voice to particular people who have their own vocabularies, their own understandings, and how to speak truth to power in the moment of that. And so that happens in units of writing that are big as a book and as tight as a sentence. I used to have to say this thing just as like a pacing thing for when I was writing my dissertation, is article by article, particle by particle. But because I would say, like, sometimes you spend a week or a month.
I can feel your dad's poetic.
Yeah. Acknowledgement to my dad, dad and my mom,
poetic sensibility,
who are poetic sensibilities from both, and refining too. So but I had to say that to say sometimes you have to spend a month or 6 months on the term you're going to use and carry with you, or the terms you're not going to use, and you're going to do that. And you also want to figure out how to be legible. I found writing first and curating second. Curating became a way to not just test language, but let it live, and also not just reach people, but meet them and have it be a feedback loop. And I think in Monument Lab's work and our collaborative team, and I think of Sue Mobley, Lori Allen, Ken Lum, and many others who have really asked questions that we want to know the answer to. We don't ask questions that we already know the answer to. We want questions that have a multitude of possibilities. And we ask questions that can be answered in an artistic installation, or they can be answered on a piece of paper. And sometimes that's handwritten and sometimes that's sketched. And so I think that all plays into the role. And so they're really meant to complement each other. They're really about finding a way to share and learn. And, I think I picked this up a lot from, of course, from artists, but also from you and from our shared mentors and shared colleagues, that, it's one thing to go out and share knowledge, but knowledge really has to be a process of reciprocity, and put the process in reciprocity, and really think about how it must be constantly going back and forth, and figure out how you do that. And for me, writing and curating are braided together.
Another thing I was thinking about is, that you and Shahrazad and our relationship to each other is, deeply collaborative and friendship, but the way that we've influenced each other. I was thinking about how with Monument Lab, when you were beginning, how Along Walk Home had a certain model, but then also Monument Lab pushes Along Walk Home. We're thinking about public space, and then we have Monument Lab, and then how I go to Newark, and then I'm thinking of it's like we're all playing off of each other in a particular way, which is really interesting. And it's really thinking about who can occupy the role of the public artist, which is historically as many things. Not only are the monuments predominantly white and male, but the artists that have been paid or commissioned or designated as people who can create public art also fit into that same demographic. And yet the relationship that the three of us have had with each other as intellectuals, as activists and artists, oftentimes, if you can look at the moment when we've started collaborating and how it's shaped 3 different organizations in really profound and exciting ways too. So I don't know, I was thinking about that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say of that. And it's one thing is just to express gratitude, because that's a gift. To be able to be in creative relationships and to honor that, and especially to enter a sacred space that's like you and your sister, let alone others. I think about it in a few ways. I mean, I think one, is coalition is incredibly important.
Yeah.
And taking the lead and being invited when you're supposed to be invited and not. And you know, I think, you know, I remember a few years ago you wrote a piece in Elle magazine about being a Black feminist scholar who has mentored white guys.
Yeah.
What was the title of it?
Yeah, I
Or
don't know.
like
Something like that. Yeah. Why it was important. And I interviewed 3 people. So yes, it was very, I don't have a lot of white male mentees, but the ones I do, they're chosen. So yes.
Yeah. Well, it's a big responsibility.
Yeah.
I think about the need to recognize my role and my place, and also to make sure to honor, again, the relationships that are there and build trust. It has to be built on trust, because we do work that's challenging ourselves, let alone other people.
Yeah.
That takes a lot of communication, that takes a lot of understanding, that takes moments of also breakdown where we have to figure out how we bring different things to the table.
Yeah.
I think for me, what I find, one, is I am pushed. And there are moments where I learn courage and clarity from you. There are moments where, and this is also the role of like teacher to mentee, where I'm like, oh, I have to step up. I have to do more.
Yeah.
Or maybe I don't have to do more. I have to do less.
It's all in your head. But
yeah.
yes.
But, you know, but then we're able to follow that up and talk. And I think that's really key.
When you go from that dynamic, which was a very short period of time, to collaborators, which is a very different dynamic. I mean, I don't think of you, I mean, we have the term friendtor, which I actually apply now because my children have friendtors. Like I've cultivated friendtors for them. But this idea of, you know, when you move from that dynamic to collaboration, which is moves back and forth between a kind of, like you said, trust and intimacy and confrontation, and you have to deal all of that in real time to create something that other people can experience. So, but you also just have a certain, I think we all operate with a certain high expectation of ourselves. And then you can build your team around that, which is sometimes very difficult for people.
Team is key.
Yeah, and I think anyone who probably works with both of us probably butts up against someone exacting standards at a high pace, which is not easy but again, those who rise to the occasion, I think it's, you know, we create some magic out there, but it may not be easy for everyone.
Well, that's something I do say is, like, before there was a big project or a stage, we were building a team.
Yeah.
And that team includes people who are going to be thought leaders out front. That also includes the people who are writing grants and building projects and project managing. And like, it's really holistic. It's like, who are the vendors that we use, and who do we trust, and where does quality and relationship meet? Really importantly. And that was also just,
I feel like we're like in the weeds, and we're like 2 managers. All
but no, but it's good.
No, it's good.
I always like to demystify it, because sometimes, you know, like, you are a leading critic. You can read your work, not just in little parts of the paper, but fold it out and, you know, turn on the TV. But you're a process person too, and you're a relationship person. I think the team is really important, and the coalition. I think also there's something here, I want to bring that back to democracy. You know, in your book, Sites of Slavery, you write about critical patriotism. And I had to write it down just to make sure I had to pull it, because I quoted it in my book. You know, as a way to engage a site of freedom and repression that, quote, neither encourages idolatry to the nation's past nor blind loyalty to the state, but through dissidence and dissent, re-engages the meta discourse of American democracy. And I think about, like,
I write so differently now too. So it's always like flashback to former self. Yeah.
But what I took away from that, and what I take away from the work that you continually do around Nina Simone, around Alice Walker, around others, is that how to be thinking about participation, how to think about engagement that's uplifting, and also how to recognize systems that have been harmful and work to push them. And I think one thing that I'm curious about, I know for myself, but I'm also curious for you, is like where your work has changed, where you find yourself, and what are the places within democracy or its institutions that you find yourself now? And how do you see your work in that vein of truth-telling as well as managing and building?
Yeah, well, one of the things I was thinking about the idea of critical patriotism. So in the Sites of Slavery, I'm looking at, obviously someone like Douglass, who gives that famous speech on what is the slave to the, what is the 4th of July to the slave, where that's not the name of it, but that's the line that people associate with the speech. And this idea of, what does it mean to be someone who's, in the case of African Americans who were enslaved in the United States, who were born here but didn't have access to the full protections of the law, and for quite a long time were not allowed to be considered citizens, or up until mid 1960s, right? So it's a very long time to be a non-citizen in the country that you were born. And so what kind of patriotism kind of comes out of that, right? And it's one in which you consistently see the demand and a yearning and an organizing for the nation to live up to this beautiful dream of democracy. I recently did a podcast, as you know, called Because of Anita, and it's about in honor of Anita Hill's testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee with allegations of sexual harassment by Supreme Court nominee Clarence Thomas. So we're on the 30th anniversary of that. And one of the beautiful moments of the podcast, third episode, is a conversation between Professor Anita Hill and Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, the first public conversation they've ever had together. And what struck me in that moment was a question or a theme of patriotism. But why did they share their story? Anita Hill didn't come forward per se, she was asked. And then Christine Blasey Ford, because of Anita Hill, came forward. And so they both had these really amazing, thoughtful answers. Anita Hill says that she knew it's important for her to share her story because she believed in the sanctity of the Supreme Court, because in her lifetime, because of Brown versus Board of Education, she had seen the power of the court to go from, she's, I think, one of 9 children, and 3 of them were able to go to integrated schools because of Brown v. Board. So she knew the power of the court. And I maybe mixing up how many children were in her family, but she knew the power of the court. It had shifted in one family, in one generation, access. And so there was too much at stake to remain silent. And so what was amazing, fascinating, mind-blowing about listening to these 2 women in conversation with each other is that they understood their role as patriots. The way that they're cast by the right is that they were somehow impeding the natural order of things, Kavanaugh's confirmation and Thomas's confirmation. But in fact, what they were doing was trying to protect the sanctity of the Supreme Court from people who, for all evidence suggests, perjured themselves, right? Supreme Court justices who lied under oath, and the women who came forward and tried to stop this inevitable flow of conservative, the court leaning to the right. And that they weren't partisan. They believed in the law. They believed in American democracy. They believed in the power of the court. And so that's a version of critical patriotism. And I think there's so many of us who live with that value system, who believe in the dream of democracy, who are outside of it, who've been hurt by it, and yet are constantly trying to make the world in America better, understanding that to make America better also is sometimes a deeply flawed and problematic project. But yeah, I think that's what I learned from being so engrossed in the world of slavery itself, but and how it was written about in the 18th and 19th centuries, but then also how contemporary African-American artists had taken up the theme, that this was a way of not pushing the story of slavery, somewhere else, but if we can engage it, if we can confront it. And again, this has to do with my own healing as a rape survivor. Because to heal, I couldn't forget the trauma. I had to figure out how to integrate it into my identity as a way of moving forward. So all of these things are related, but yeah, critical patriotism. And then I think I was reminded of what it meant through this experience with Professor Hill and Dr. Ford.
Yeah, and let's be really clear. I mean, the podcast, incredibly powerful. If you, in this room or in our Zoom room, by all means go and check this out. And you also were just in conversation in a fantastic event with a number of important feminist activists and scholars at USC, including Dr. Hill. We have a few minutes left. So I know I have one more question for you.
Okay.
I want to hand it over to you if you have one more question
Well,
or thing to add.
I did. I mean, one of the questions I think when we started with my intellectual biography, but there's always a curiosity, and I think I know some of the answers, but your openness and your deep commitment to democracy. So I come from a position of being outside, right? And I think you probably would identify yourself as outside too, but I was just curious, you're so, I don't know, you're so open and you're so inclusive, and in many ways you have a very Black feminist vision of what I would say is what democracy should look like. So I'm just curious, when did you realize maybe that was the tradition you were in, or I don't know. It's a big question, I think.
Yeah.
There are many traditions we can claim, and I don't even know if you claim that one, but I was just curious, was there an epiphany?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's ongoing. But I do. I appreciate my parents who valued education and pushed me to think and read and talk with people. I think about my grandfather, Sam Spicer, who passed away when I was very young, but he left. He left writing and recordings. He was a public school teacher and a newspaper editor in Feltonville here in Philly. We found things, like in bounded books and in coffee cans and in our attic. And whenever I've found his words, they've given me purpose. Like he was asking questions about, right before we did the first Monument Lab project, we found in the back of a filing cabinet a book that he had written and never published. And there was a chapter in it written in the 70s. Before I was born in it, and the chapter was, let's turn 10,000 abandoned homes in Philadelphia into 10,000 rays of hope. And we found in the rest of the book, he was asking questions about juvenile jail. So most of his work was focused on reframing issues impacting young people who were being criminalized and being separated in their educational systems, and trying to create what he called positive emotional vitamins. And so even before I knew about his writing and found it, that was energy and appreciation. I think a lot, I grew up in Jewish education and Quaker education. And I encountered a number of teachers and educators who connected the ideas of learning and justice very fundamentally from an early age. Jewish education, you are taught not just the importance of memory, but the importance of tikkun olam, to heal the world. It's a recognition that the world that you inherit is broken, and your healing is a part of that, and you must heal yourself and others. I had teachers at a very young age. My first and second grade teacher, Carol Corson, was a white Quaker woman who went to the March on Washington and talked to us about what it meant to be there as a white person. And we had another teacher in that class, LaRose Ray, who's a Black woman in Philadelphia. And I don't remember what exactly all was said, but I remember like the purpose and the burden. My third and fourth grade teacher, Teresa Maibori, was a Japanese American woman who was born in an internment camp. And while we did our lessons about history that everyone had, she shared those stories, and it just made sense. And actually in that class, it was the first paper I ever wrote. I mean, we actually have it somewhere, but she encouraged me to write. And the first paper I wrote as a fourth grader was about the civil rights movement. And I interviewed my first grade teacher. I mean, there's a bibliography. There's like 2 books on it. We were learning how to write. But I went back and read it. And in it, I reflect on the legacies of segregation in my community. I didn't call it legacies of segregation, but I said there's still racism in all of us. And we have to work against it. So it was just, that was the purpose. I think I learned a lot from my teachers. I also think about the late Byron Davis, who was my 7th grade history teacher. He's gone on to teach many people. He's the father of Kai Davis, a poet. Lots of other people have been a part of his world. And he just brought history to life. Like history was in the book, history was in the museum. He brought it to life. And so I think of those moments as really important, that when you are learning from coalitions of people, when you are reading coalitions of people, when you're thinking, I think it gave me a different relationship to the past. I think it's an education that continues to this day, but that it takes away the kind of disingenuous shock of the like monuments are coming down today. Why is that? Well, if you were just listening to music, reading poetry, listening, like we would have already known this. And I listened to and encountered the source. So I think of that as part of the trajectory that I'm still on now and trying to learn from and learn with.
I love that. So you can ask me your final question. I was thinking, I have a fourth grader who just wrote a paper on recycling. That's what so maybe
when we read that.
We're like, oh, who knows what she'll become, but yeah.
So last, I want to close with this is like, this is a conversation about art, activism, and democracy. And we'd be remiss to not acknowledge our democracy is threatened. It's always been compromised. We're not in a new situation, as you said. It's an ongoing project to have a full democracy, and so we want to say that. And I also want to say that in this moment, like even to be here together with you is a gift. We've been through the pandemic. And I'm curious for you, even in the most challenging of times, and I'll put that as now. What are sources of hope for you? Either for self-care, for group care, for democracy care, that you're leaning on or that you're drawing from?
Yeah, I mean, I gave a talk recently at the Omega Institute, and it'll bring us back to monuments. But I was talking about, what was it like to experience the pandemic as a sexual assault survivor, and the ways in which there's the catastrophe that we're all enveloped in and that disproportionately hurt certain communities. And then there was this sense of like, what's next, right? And one, as a survivor, I understood this sense of powerlessness, the sense of being triggered, the sense of not being able to control your surroundings, not being afraid of what's happening to your body. But then I also, as the anxiety that we have and about what's next, and I think this is the question of democracy itself too. I think as someone who's had to reassemble her life, and art and therapy and community and family have been so crucial in that rebuilding. But literally in our performance, we have this poem that I wrote, in which but the actress who's playing me is reassembling or finding new parts of her body. And we have this line, it's like my new old body. This sense that with loss, and in the case of the pandemic or in the case of sexual assault, something that's put on you, something that you don't choose, and yet you have to figure out how to restore yourself as a result. That I think is a unique gift that survivors can share, because we're all survivors now, but that's a unique gift that I think I understood as a sexual assault survivor in this moment. And so one of the things my talk was basically about this idea of something falling down and then what's born in its place. And so I actually talked about the mural that we made. But I guess that's where I have a sense that possibility is there. Not to say that we need chaos to create possibility, but that through systems falling, that if we organize, if we're prepared enough, if we're paying attention to the world around us in its most beautiful form, then there's possibility of freedom, there's possibility of newness, there's possibility of new coalitions being born. The obvious part, the fear though, of course, is that this idea of democracy is going to be replaced with a demagogue. And we are so close to that, and yet also we're so close to that. I think that the challenge that we were facing though, and I remember Cornel West saying this after 9/11, what America's facing is what dispossessed people have always, it's not that democracy itself is up for grabs. It's that it's a nationalizing of the precarious position that Black and brown people experience in America. So it's white people actually experience what we know is true as Black people, that democracy has never been true, right? Democracy has always been shifting. It's always been up for grabs. That's what it means to be Black in America. And it means to see the systems that are supposed to protect you falling apart. What's new, I think, is that more Americans, more non-people of color, more white Americans are in that space of precarity. And so that becomes the crisis. And so I think what the possibility is to continue to learn from the people who've had to live in America as a matter of fact, that that's our truth. And then how we've organized, how we've tried to build democracy, how we've tried to push America to become its best self. That's where the answer lies. We already know it's not this broken democracy that we're seeing is an expansion of an already broken system. So then learn from the people who've been trying to hold the system accountable before this moment. So that's what I would say. Yeah. I don't know.
On that note,
On
I
that
want to
note.
say thank you,
Thank you.
Salamishah Tillet.
Thank you.
so-
So nice.
So this program again is part of honoring Salamishah with the Monument Lab's first ever Changemaker Award, which we'll be doing tonight
Yes.
as a part of our fall gathering. And if you are coming to join us tonight, we look forward to having you here 6 to 9 p.m. You can still get tickets here or online, monumentlab.com. And then I also want to encourage you, if you're not able to be here, you can still support the work of Monument Lab as a nonprofit by donating or going to our store, monumentlab.com, and also to support the work of A Long Walk Home, alongwalkhome.org. But I want to, again, gratitude to Salamishah. We'll continue celebrating with you, and thank you everybody who joined us.
Thank
Have a
you,
good
Paul.
evening.
Thank you. This is so meaningful. Thank you.